You are listening to ProveText, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to ProveText and Glossa House TV. I am Dr. Michael Halcomb, and today I have the great privilege of talking with David Goodwin. He is a co-author of Battle for the American Mind, which I want to talk about, and he's associated with the Association of Classical Christian Schools, which if you move in the Christian school world, you are very familiar with the ACCS and Repairing the Ruins Conference and some other things. So we're gonna get into that, and I think you guys will enjoy this. But David, we talked just for a few minutes. Can I call you David in the interview? Is that fine?
Oh, certainly. That'd be great.
So
good
David,
to be with you, Michael.
Yeah, it's good to have you here. We talked just for a few minutes. We'd never met before this, and before we hit record here, just getting to know each other a little bit. And as we get started, you folks will notice that I'm not in my regular place. I'm at a friend's house. I was affected by the hurricane Helene recently, and so I've been doing a little bit of traveling and looking forward to getting back into my regular routine and getting our school or college back up and running. But I'm also glad to be here despite different settings, talking to you, David, and looking forward to seeing where this goes. Tell us a little bit about where you are and then maybe the ACCS, and we'll go from there.
Well, yes, I am the president of the Association of Classical Christian Schools. Our main offices are in Boise, Idaho, which you're looking at one of the studios we use for training and developing training for schools. So we do a lot of that. We do work with about 550 schools across the country, and we accredit, I think, in one status or another, we're getting closer to 100. We obviously are a newer movement. We've been around in the Christian school world for about 20, 30 years. Obviously, classical Christian education was sort of burst on the scene in about 1991, 92, and we were the original association. And then I obviously, in the course of my work, I often talk to people in the media, and I had an interview at one point many years ago now, 3 or 4, with Pete Hegseth, and he was so encouraged by the story he wanted to write a book with me, and so we developed Battle for the American Mind. It became a New York Times #1 bestseller, and it's really, I'm told it's the best-selling education book in at least 20 years. So.
Wow. Congratulations on that. So let's talk a little bit about the book, and you have a follow-up coming. I don't know if I'm supposed to say that or not, but we don't have to go too much into that. We don't have to, don't want to give things away if we're not at that point. But let's talk about the book there, Battle for the American Mind, and what's the impetus for that? What's the occasion of writing it?
Well, the story is, I think, in some ways the most interesting. If you know Pete Hegseth, he's a Fox News personality, pretty conservative guy, Christian guy. He called me once after he does these kind of man on the street interviews, but he does them in diners, and he was in a diner in North Carolina and crossed paths with some students who were from one of our schools with their mom, and he was impressed, and she said, well, then you need to contact the association. So he contacted me, and we started a conversation. Usually these conversations go about 20 minutes, and I expected that's what it would do. And I think he was just trying to find sort of a patriotic form of education, something that he could encourage people to jump into. He didn't have a lot of experience, virtually none, with classical Christian schools, but he knew a little bit. And so we started out, and about 20 minutes in, he said something about the Pledge of Allegiance, and I kind of hemmed and hawed and mentioned that actually it had some good purposes, but it was originally authored by a socialist. to replace the Christian creeds in public schools in the late 1800s. And so he was
Did not know that. Yeah.
yes, and so he didn't know it. Very few people know it. Francis Bellamy's the guy's name who wrote it. It originally, of course, did not contain "under God" in it. They wouldn't have put that, obviously in it originally. And originally there's quite a story on it. If you Google it, it's a little disturbing at times. But pretty much the entire U.S. used this from about 1905 through to 1942, and then of course it was modified. But anyway, I could tell that Pete was kind of like, what, just sort of the reaction you just had. And so I said, let me send you a manuscript that I'd written. So I sent him a couple of chapters from the manuscript, and I got a call back maybe a week or two later, and he goes, this story is amazing. We've got to get this, get a documentary produced. So Fox Nation produced a documentary called The Miseducation of America. It's a 6-part series. It became the most downloaded, most binge-watched show on Fox Nation. And so they struck a second season of it, and that's out there as well. And then Pete said, we got to get your book published. And so this is right after COVID. So we published, it was hard for me to get it published because I'm really nobody in terms of the media world. And so he jumped in and said, let me help you write it. I'll put a few chapters in. You can do some chapters, and we'll have the book. So that's how it got started. Basically, it just tells the story of how the progressives intentionally, starting in about 1905, built the American public school system as we now know it for the purpose of taking over the country. And that sounds like a radical, wild statement that when we first talked to the publisher, for example, they said, I'm not sure about the conspiracy theory thing. And our response was, there's no conspiracy theory. This was done in the open press. It's documented in the New Republic, in the Progressive. Of course, at the time, the Progressives were not as well known as a movement. They didn't dominate, for example, the Democratic Party, but they were small enough that they thought they could be candid, and they wrote this material. Well, you can just go to the library and read it. That's what I did. Is I heard a quote. Wow, where did they get that? The quote I heard came from a lecture from a Hillsdale professor, where he talked about the progressives wanting to control what was called the plasticity of the child's mind. And I thought that sounds a little bit ominous. So I went and I thought, I'll just find that quote so I can see what the context was. And I went to the library, and they gave me a dusty pile of books or magazines from the early 1800s, and I started going through them. Early 1900s. And I started going through them. And in 1916, I found the quote. But the thing was, it wasn't just the quote. There was an entire diatribe going on between the editorial board and various people in the progressive movement that were going to take over America by taking over its educational system. And I was like, I walked out of the library that day, and I was like, my word, they didn't even hide it. It was just like their plan of record. And so it was then that I happened upon a book on my way out of the library called American Education, written by a pretty eminent scholar. His name was Lawrence Kremen at Columbia University. And I thought it was a big 3-volume set, and one of them had won a Pulitzer Prize. So I thought, well, maybe I should pick this up and see if there's any scholarship behind this, or if this is just something that was a kind of a flash in the pan that seemed obvious to me. And sure enough, in his book, he directly states that was their purpose, was to take over the political and cultural control of America by building the progressive education system, which is now the public school system. And of course, it's a generational project. So we chronicle in the book how generation by generation, they have taken over the hearts and minds of kids, changed the way they see the world, and now, surprise, surprise, there's actually a contest between Kamala Harris and anyone else, right? I mean, I don't know when this will air. Who knows who's going to win? But the fact that there's even a contest, given the platform that the Democratic Party has moved to, which even if you're a Christian who doesn't like politics, you have to acknowledge that there's probably not been such an evil platform since the Romans were Christianized in the first century, at least not in the West. And so the reason that that's even possible the reason that we're in this situation is because of this move that the progressives made 100 years ago. So that's what the book is about. It goes into the detail, and then it explains what they replaced. Probably I'm going on here, I apologize for that, but probably the axis of the book is a metaphor that Pete and I put together, where prior to 1905, when they started this project, it was like Western civilization had this diamond, this hope diamond, great big thing, in a highly secured place called classical Christian education. And this had been in practice for 1,500 years. And it had created the world of our founding fathers. All our founding fathers were educated this way. You couldn't throw a rock and hit a classically educated person up until about 1905. And so the progressives had a problem. And that was that you'd notice if they just up and got rid of that, the people wouldn't have stood for it. So what they did, and Pete and I use this metaphor, is they cut a piece of glass to look like it, and they swapped it on the pressure plate really. And that was the progressive education system. And they knew they had to replace Jesus Christ with something. So they replaced him with American. The Pledge of Allegiance, the picture, flag flying over every school, the pictures of John Dewey, Horace Mann, and George Washington, all three in the front. Two of those people you may not know. That's because they were the founders of the American public education system. 25 desks in a classroom facing straight forward, textbooks that were written by constructed progressive teachers' colleges that were training the teachers, accreditation that supported that. They built the system that changed the hearts and minds of America. So that's what the axis of the book is this swap. Classical Christian education stolen, and progressive education put on play.
When they were developing this, did they have any idea how long it would take? Were they thinking we'll get this taken over in a decade, 2 decades? I mean, did they have a long game plan? And if they did, like, how long did they think it was going to take?
It seemed to me from reading their work that they knew it was going to be generational, and a generation, of course, of 40 years. So I think it varied because this was not one person. This was not just John Dewey. He's kind of the classic father of modern American education, but it was John Dewey with a bunch of other guys, Charles Potter. These guys were humanists, secular humanists, and I mean Charles Potter is famous. His quote is in the book. Kind of summarize it here, but he basically says, if you give me the kids 6 days a week and then try and teach them in Sunday school 1 day a week, I'll own the children in this country. And so he co-signed the Humanist Manifesto with John Dewey. John Dewey, and he wrote it. They were the people who built our public education system. So this is not, like I said, a big secret. It's what was done to America by these folks. And so they knew it was going to take time. I think they made a lot of progress up until about 1950, 55. And in there, the space race kind of recentered from changing kids' hearts and minds into science and math. Yeah. And then it kind of came back in the 60s. So it's vacillated a little bit. I think that they have fully now reached their goal. I think that they reached the goal of creating what's called a progressive paideia. Paideia is the word that the classical world used for what they called plasticity, although they also used the word paideia because they knew it, and so did Lawrence Kremen. So they replaced the Western Christian paideia with this progressive paideia. And then around 2000, they completed it to a Marxist paideia. So now that's why the kids coming out of school are so messed up, is that the very depth of what they're learning, the very core, is evil.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've pointed a lot of people to the Kirk and Masden book. I don't know, After the Ball. I don't know if you're familiar with that one, but in that, they wrote that about 1981. And those two laid out a step-by-step plan. I've talked about it on the podcast here before, for how to make American society not just gay affirming, but and not just gay accepting and gay affirming, but essentially how to become gay and like infiltrate the entire social fabric with gay and lesbian. The T wasn't even a thing at that point, really. They had the LGB, but I mean, it was everything from which magazine and newspaper boardrooms to get into, to what kind of commercials they would have. They'd show the angry preacher banging his fist and make him look crazy and ravenous. And, it's a just step by step plan that they've followed to a T since 1981. And like you said, it's now, full on neo-Marxist, if you want to use that language, neo-socialist, whatever. But that's also an interesting book to just look at the last, 40 years of what's gone on with education, and particularly like the education of sexuality in the United States. And they've written a few articles as well that go along with this, but it's interesting. What's really fascinating to me is the long-term plan, like the long game. And
yeah, I mean,
yeah,
I'm vaguely familiar with the work you talked about, but this, of course, a lot of people know Rules for Radicals, Saul Alinsky. We talk about that.
right.
That's when 1950s, 60s. What they needed was first to replace the Western Christian paideia, because it would never have accepted the gay lifestyle. And then they needed, so what they replaced it with was kind of this Americana approach, apple pie garden.
Yes.
And that became the nature of the American classroom. And then they started to tear that down, because you couldn't have any God before the progressives. The progressives had to control who was God. And that had to be individual progressive Marxism,
Nice.
individualistic progressive Marxism. So by the 1980s, that's when I often cite that time period as when they started refilling the empty cup that they'd managed to pour out. They filled it up with the virtues of cultural Marxism and individual sexuality, and a lot of those features. So what you were looking at is a downstream byproduct of what the progressives intended.
Right. Yeah, that's incredible. I wasn't aware of some of that backstory that you shared. So that's fascinating. And I feel like conservatives on the one hand and Christians on the other hand, if you want to put the two together, conservative Christians, I feel like they in general aren't long game looking people. And I don't know. I don't get the sense that they're thinking generationally, and I think that's a huge difference and a huge problem. And people like Rod Dreher and others have been calling us to back to this sort of thing. Like we need to be thinking generationally like this. But I think it's a major problem. And the flag. All right, the flag. Let's talk about that for a minute. All right, because I think a lot of Christians, you do the whole Christian nationalism thing. However we want to define that. And to some that's a more derogatory term. To some it's a less derogatory term. But this defense of the flag without, for example, knowing the backstory of the Pledge of Allegiance. I wonder if a lot of these people who would call themselves Christian and feel so strongly about the flag would feel so strongly about it if they had been educated on the backstory of it, for example. So that's I guess like two different things here. Like I want to pick your mind about like the long-term generational like view that each camp has or doesn't have. And then that whole, like, the whole flag thing, because that's become a big thing in the last few years. Colin Kaepernick and, kneeling and not, standing for the flag and these sorts of things. So let's talk about these two issues, if you don't mind. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So the problem with Christian nationalism is that when people think it's about America, they miss the point. The point is that God created nations. It's done right at the Tower of Babel. Separated the language, created the nations. And when Jesus Christ comes, what's he say? He says, all power in heaven and earth have been granted to me. I've been given authority over it all. Now go disciple the nations. So he's not saying get rid of the nations. He's just saying disciple the nations. So there's nothing wrong with America having a national identity and that national identity being important to people. What's wrong is if that national identity gets put on the altar and turned into a religion, because Christianity is the basis for America originally. Now, there's a lot of people who have differences of opinion about the founding fathers and how many of them were Christians. I can't see calling Madison or Jefferson a Christian. Neither one of them were Christians. And there were others who were in the mix, but not. We talk about this in the book.
Yeah.
But that's not really the point. The point is the paideia that they were operating from was this concept of paideia, this sort of underlying precepts, worldview, if you will, cosmology, if you will, the whole way you see the world was embedded in them through education. Even Thomas Jefferson and Madison were embedded with a classical Christian education, which is why Jefferson, when he struggled with it, decided he was going to rewrite the Bible because he didn't like some parts of it, but he knew how important it was, right? So we have to be clear-eyed about this and realize America is not perfect. And America is, but it is in many ways the outworking of a Christian mental model that was put in place that said man's sinful. Any government you put in place is going to become corrupt. So we will put in as many obstacles to corruption as we can. We're going to divide, 3 branches of government. We're going to have checks and balances, all of this stuff. The whole Bill of Rights. Okay, so if all of that goes wrong, then the next fallback, and the guys who were supporting the Bill of Rights were closer to Christian truth, John Jay and those guys. The Bill of Rights says, okay, so even if these branches get corrupt, at least they're going to have to overcome this constitutional right to free speech, the constitutional right to religion, etc. So you see a lot of Christian elements in it. I think Christian nationalism, if it gets misplaced and people think the flag is part of Christianity, then I think it's a dangerous thing. If they think that the flag and America is the best form of government that has been proposed by man, and that Christianity is essential to its survival, then I think they're right on. I think that's our problem, is that we cannot survive as a nation unless we both love the nation, but most importantly, we love Jesus Christ, and we trust. Not every person has to. Not every person loved Jesus Christ 250 years ago, but every person at the time recognized that Jesus Christ was the most influential man in history, and what he said was probably true. At least that much was universally accepted. And that's where we're at now. So that's, I think, the Christian nationalism side a little bit. In terms of long view, taking the long view, you'd asked about that. Yeah. Here's the funny thing. Christians had the longest view of any civilization in history, probably. The only one that you could really handle that with might be Egypt, because of their view of death. But the Christians had a tremendous long view. They started cathedrals that took 400 years to build.
Right.
5, 6 multiple generations of masons died before the thing was ever completed. And they did it because it was bringing glory to God. Right. And that was their motive. And so the church used to be the definition of long thinking. It was the original long view. And when Marx writes in the mid-19th century, you have two things happen. On the atheist side, you have Marx, who writes a book that says all we have to do is free the proletariat and they will revolt against the bourgeois, and we will have a communist revolution and everything will be leveled and flat and we won't have any hierarchy. Of course, that doesn't happen. So by the time the progressives in the early part of the 20th century are looking at it, they're going, we aren't going to get Marxism through a revolution because people just aren't that upset. What we're going to have to do is have a cultural revolution. We're going, and of course Mao famously did this in the late 60s, but in the sphere of Marxism, the new cultural revolution was, if we can't make them unhappy with their economic state, we'll make them hate each other because of color, because of race, because of gender, because of sexuality. Divide everybody up into little fractions and then get them fighting. And then we'll be able to tear everything down to the ground, because you can't build a new thing until you raise the old thing to the ground. And so that's when they got the long view, was around the turn of the 20th century. On the Christian side, the reason Christians didn't combat this is that there was a move in the Christian world in the 19th century, as most people are aware, called dispensationalism, in terms of a form of what's called eschatology. That's a $2 word for end time. But and other, revivalism, that sort of thing. The Christian view of the world went from 400 or 500 year projects that they were happy to work on for that long, down to how many people can you tell about the gospel in a particular short time period and get them saved before the world ends. It was always this sort of urgency where nothing long term mattered because it's all going to burn. That was never the view of Christians prior to 1700.
Wow, yeah. Wow. It's interesting to make that connection. Wow. So how do we, beyond reframing our eschatology, like how does the Christian community recover the long view? And I guess I assume one of your answers would be through classical Christian education, through like the education that was hijacked, like bringing it back into view. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Well, that's great. I want to jump into the education side, but I think there's a difference in perspective that we need to get there first with, which is, if you were to talk to one of these Masons, say, who built Ulm Cathedral, which was one of the tallest cathedrals in the world for a long time. It was only eclipsed by the Eiffel Tower, I think, eventually. If you were to talk to this Mason and say, why are you doing this? Why are you chiseling away at 50 stones in your life that are going to go into this thing, and then you're going to die? Why? He would have, hopefully, I think he would have said, faithfulness. Because I'm just one of God's servants, one of millions. So I can't change the world overnight myself, but I can contribute to a project out of faith that I know God is going to do something great with down the line. And of course, we talk about the cathedrals because they're these big things that you can still see, but they were doing this in scholastic work. They built all the universities for the same reason. The Reformation occurred for the same reason. The establishment of the printing press was all done for the same reason. It's the Bible so that we can take dominion over the world as Christians and live faithfully. So I think that the first ingredient we have to restore is the idea of faithful living. In other words, don't live pragmatically such that whatever you're working on in this moment has to have an obvious and immediate outworking, but rather it's consistent with the man Jesus Christ and what he would do. Because, shoot, talk about long views. He came, died on the cross, ascended to his Father, and we're waiting his return. He's been out 2,000 years. It's not that he's slow. It's that he's faithful. He's faithful to the cause of the Trinity. And that's where I think being a Christ follower is being faithful. So I think that's the first ingredient. Then building things like schools, building things like anything that has, families, schools, long-term investment in people is where we can start, because people are eternal.
Yeah. Wow. Really interesting stuff. So you're also part of this Repairing the Ruins conference. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Give us some details about that, and I'll see if I can screen share here while you're doing that.
Oh, sure. Well, the movement started in the mid-90s, and we started a conference back then, and it's still going. Repairing the Ruins occurs every summer, sometime in mid-June. It is the gathering of classical Christian educators, and of course, originally it was just a few handfuls of people. Now we've got about 1,500 who come to the conference every year. And it is a gathering. What you're looking there, you can see some of the speakers that were speaking this last year. That one in the upper left is a really great. If you get a chance to play that is it's spontaneous song that broke out in the lobby of the hotel at Repairing the Ruins where we were. It's not part of our program. It just happened in the evening as part of a gathering that actually originally a student who happened to be at the conference organized. So it's a great place to be encouraged. It's mostly for classical educators.
Right. Okay. I just had Joe Rigney on the show not too long ago, and then some of his colleagues have come on as well. So, yeah, interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
Joe's on our board.
Okay. Yeah, we talked about his new book on leadership. Excellent little book. And I'll point people back to that interview as well, Joe Rigney, and go check out that interview and get a hold of his book. So you have this Repairing the Ruins conference coming up again in June. This is in Dallas, Texas. And what can people sort of expect? I mean, mainly classical educators. What's usually like the theme? Is it recovering classical education? Like what is Repairing the Ruins?
It is. It's recovering education. We have a little sub-conference we do around it. We're planning one that involves supporting and helping to develop classical Christian education. But in general, what you'd find at the conference is the major speakers come from all across all spectrums. We've had, Ben Carson was there a couple of years ago. Al Mohler's frequently with us. Of course, Doug Wilson, George Grant, Meg Bassram was there. So those kind of the conservative wing of the biblical Christian world are often friends of ours. The late Chuck Colson spoke at our conference. So we frequently have friends all over the place because the odd thing to me was I got into this. I grew up. I didn't really know anything about classical education, didn't have any background in it. It's part of why I think I can write books that people can understand what it is, because I really am an outsider to it. So when I look at it, I can explain it in kind of ways that people can understand. But all of these key Christian leaders have sort of a synergy with classical education because they've seen it. Al Mohler, for example, he is a big fan of classical Christian education. Chuck Colson said something like, "This is the last best hope for Western civilization." That's typically what we get. So that's what happens on the main stage. There's lots of workshops, 90 some, that cover how to teach and those sorts of things. So it's kind of a teachers conference in that context. The comment I get most is that teachers who've been to other Christian education conferences say this is like a big worship service, which is kind of what we recognize one of the key differences of classical Christian education is that we don't have an academic branch and a Christian side where we put a chapel and a Bible class on top of academics. We use the medieval model, which was completely superimposed. So every talk is about the Lordship of Jesus Christ and worshiping Jesus Christ and our God. And the how is always, the subject of the talk. How do we do that through grammar, logic, and rhetoric? How do we do that through the training of the great books? How do we do that through the development of language skills in children? How do we do it through virtue? That's usually what the conference is.
Yeah, great. And so you guys have vendors and different speakers and all sorts of things. Is there any space or place for friends of the classical Christian movement, someone who may be teaching like in a public school setting, that would benefit from coming to this and maybe implementing something they've gathered from the conference into their public school classroom, anything like that?
Yes, every year, I'm pretty, I'm running around like sticking with my head cut off at the conference a lot of times because there's a lot of people pulling at me. But one of the most common things I get are people coming up to me who've never been engaged in classical education, heard about it from a friend or from a teacher, or they were in public school and they just took a job with a classical Christian school and they're there to learn how to do it. They come up to me all the time and they're like, "This is not like anything I've ever experienced."
Yeah.
Because, like I said, the unique thing about the medieval mind, which is what we're using as our inspiration for the restoration of classical Christian education, is that there was no light between daily life and Christ. It was, all of life for all of Christ for all of life. And so if, we think of political things and Christian things, but then you look at something like just war theory, and it was monks who proposed that. It's like the Christian world built. It's not one of the things Pete and I, when we do our two-way kind of shows on stage and stuff, we talk about the fact that the lights, the fact that we're not living in a cave somewhere, because most of Europe, when Rome fell, went into darkness, right? City states with people sweeping through and stealing your crops, the Sacs, either the Vikings on one side or the Slavs on the other. It was pretty dark. And the church raised that up by organizing communities, organizing families, providing civic structure, providing a legal system. I think that's what you get surprised by when you come to the conferences. We're all over the place. It isn't about whether you use the right paper in elementary school. It's about the big picture of how do we educate kids who will lead this country.
Right.
And it's not a patriotic thing, but we love patriotism. It's not a worship service because we are the church, but we worship. And again, if anybody wants to see just a little slice of it, watching the bit of that first that impromptu thing that happened in the hotel, the hotel management told us later that they really loved it because it was beautiful song right in the. Anyway, it's a lot of fun to come to. I'd encourage anybody who's interested in classical education to do that. Get my book, read about it, and if you find that intriguing, then come.
Yeah. And I apologize for I don't want to put you on the spot, but I do know you have another book coming down the pipeline. Are you able to talk about that here or no?
Yeah, I can in general terms. When we got done with Battle for the American Mind and we went on the publicity tour, the question we kept getting is, okay, so we end Battle for the American Mind. It's kind of funny. It's almost like a novel. It has kind of a cliffhanger ending. We end it with the fact that, okay, this could look pretty hopeless. We just watched how it took 100 years for the progressives to take over the hearts and minds of our kids. How are we going to get that back? Where do we go? And Pete and I were sitting in a room trying to figure out how we're going to end this book. So you got to end it, you got to end it well. And I said, Pete, weren't you in Afghanistan? What did you do in Afghanistan? And he said, well, I was a counterinsurgent. So I said, why don't you write this last chapter as though you were telling insurgents how to take over a country, because that's what you were fighting against when you were in Afghanistan. So the end of the book is calling for an insurgency by Christians in the classroom, using classical Christian education to build an insurgency. Well, when we got done, the big question we kept getting asked is, how do we do this? You told me there's a conference. You've told me that there's, in the book, there's like chapters 7, 8, 9, 10 kind of describe classical education, but nobody tells us how to do it. So the book that I'm working on right now, it's yet untitled, and should be out next summer, is on how to do classical education, sort of from a 50,000 foot view. Obviously, it's a big project. Classical education with practice for 2,000 years, and anybody who knows anything about long-term projects, they morph and change over time. So trying to figure out what actually was practiced varies. So, and it's a very highly differentiated form. So the book is an overview of how to run a classical school. It starts K, goes through 12. Good for homeschool parents who want to do it with their kids. Good for micro schools. We want to get everybody involved. Everybody can do this. It doesn't have to be done just in fancy prep schools or some such thing. It's good for everyone.
Wow. I having, had my family been a part of the classical movement for a long time. I've been an educator in the classical movement. I feel like there are a lot of strengths, with classical Christian education. I also know that there are weaknesses. And, one of those weaknesses, at least from where I sit, and maybe you can speak to this, but having been in it from various angles, um, I'm not sure that. All right, so you have people who haven't been classically trained, like in the, running classical school. I don't know if that's a problem. Maybe it is. It seems like it could be, but I also think there's a lot of discontinuity between what each classical school looks like. That could be a strength and a weakness at the same time. And I also think there's like a certain leadership profile. And I remember reading an article about this. It's like a white Presbyterian man and his, who's around 30. He's got an MDiv from a Presbyterian seminary. And for me, like that the white male thing, that's not a big deal, whatever. But anybody could sort of fit the bill. But the MDiv from the Presbyterian institutions, that's an interesting thing, so that you're getting these people out of seminary who went through an MDiv but don't necessarily know how to lead a school. So I don't know. There are like all these issues that I've seen and experienced within the classical movement that I feel like some of those loose ends need to be tied up, and like some of those things need to be soldered and like put together. I'm wondering if you want to speak to any of those. I don't want to be overly critical or whatever, but do you see other things that need to be addressed from where you sit? You're certainly a lot more deep into it than I am, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on those sorts of things.
Yeah, Michael, actually, you bring up an excellent point. It's a really good point, and it fits into our story a little bit here. So public schools in this country have a heavy infrastructure underneath them To teach in them, you go to teachers college. When you come out of the teachers college, you got to be licensed by the state. The state also dictates the curriculum that's taught in most schools, and the state says what a graduation requirement is and how you graduate. You get a state authorized diploma, which is universally accepted in colleges based upon the accreditation system. The accreditation of schools is done through this regional system. All this was set up by the progressives. We reject it all because we have to. The progressives were out to destroy the hearts and minds of kids. We can't let them even have a foothold anywhere. So we don't typically hire teachers who, there are some public school teachers who are able to have that metanoia experience and turn from their public school ways and become classical educators, and we're thankful for those. But in general, we need all new systems. That's what the ACCS does, or the association. We call it CADE, which is certification, accreditation, diploma authorization, and endorsement. And then we have training, which is supporting. Well, that's still being built. It's very expensive to build. We're struggling to build that. We need the support from people to do that financially and otherwise. That's one answer to the question, is that you've got to train and raise people in this. A second answer to the question is that one of the things that keeps me up at night is that we did a study. I say that metaphorically. We did a study called the Good Soil Survey. You can find it on classicalchristian.org. And what it is a survey done by Notre Dame University. It was a pretty broad and pretty important survey, looking at 5 different types of schools, one of which was classical Christian, and comparing it to other evangelical Christian schools, to home schools, to preparatory schools, and public schools. And so this looked at all aspects and walks of life from 24 to 44-year-olds who graduated from these schools. And we did this survey in 2019. Yeah, 2019. And so if you do the math on kids who are 24 to 44, these kids were educated mostly in the 90s, which was when we had fewer than 100 schools, and the quality control was basically driven by the fact that everybody knew everybody, and everybody was doing their best to try and work it out in small classrooms, and with the inspiration of the Spirit, all of that. Now we're in a different phase. We're in a phase where it's grown so much and it's become so popular that we don't have infrastructure to train and develop the teachers, the school, the graduation requirements, all of that. So we're building it, and we're working on that right now. It's probably a 5-year project to get to the baseline. We've done accreditation for like 10, 15 years. Actually, we've been in it 20 years, but it's still an up and coming thing. It's hard for these schools. I think before we went on the podcast, I mentioned that there are about 550 member schools, but fewer than 100 are accredited. The reason for that is these schools are still in their nascent phase, where many of them, have 70, 80, 90 students. They're in a church basement. We have to get them up to full, when parents come to us, they're looking for a classical Christian school that's accredited, because those are the schools that have a depth and a richness to them. And so that's what we're working on as a project, is to help standardize a lot of things. In some ways, it's kind of a modern idea to standardize, but I think it's good because what you're talking about is a very real, very practical reality.
Yeah. Well, man, this has been a really a fun interview for me, informative as well. I've learned a number of things, so I'm always grateful for that. Still an advocate for classical education, classical Christian education, even though I've stepped out of those circles several years ago. It's good to be, at least even using the podcast platform we have to promote the work you're doing, and other colleagues in the classical movement, the work that they're doing as well. So I'd love when you're, ahead of your next book, or when it comes out, I'd love to talk to you again and, help get the word out about that. It's exciting. Remind us one more time of the name of the series, The Miseducation The one that Fox
Yeah,
did.
on Fox Nation, so you have to subscribe. It's an online service, but it's called The Miseducation of America. And that's season 1 is the one with most of the information in it. Season 2 is looking at a broader set of issues.
Okay, great.
And then there's a couple of specials that Pete and I did as well. And then, of course, the book Battle for the American Mind is actually pretty reasonably priced right now. I don't know what's going on. They've got Amazon is pretty cheap. And then classicalchristian.org is kind of the directory to all things. If you dig around there, you'll find something fun.
Great. And yeah, for those watching too, check out over at glossahouse.com. Colton Moore and Ben House just released a book, Beyond the Horizon, and it's making case for classical Christian education. It's a great little book. I encourage you to pick that up and get a copy of Battle for the American Mind, which is a lower list price than usual right now. And you can check out the Repairing the Ruins conference and Association of Classical Christian Schools. There's a nice little map on there. You can see where, at least last time I checked, there was a map on there, and you could see where,
that map's directly connected to our database, so it's up to date. There's a web page for every school that we maintain that'll tell you how big it is, who's running it, what the, bona fides of it are, all that.
Excellent. Well, man, David, it's great meeting you. I hope we get to talk again. And if I can ever do anything for you, let me know. But those of you watching, listening, thanks for doing so. Check out glossahouse.com and all the other sites that we've mentioned here. We're going to wrap it up here and say we hope that helps.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.